Hello, aspirants of Technovids. Today we are going to see all new features of Technovids Training Academy that have made a remarkable training impact during this COVID pandemic. We are a new generation training company, and we understand how boring it is to study yourself. Yeah, I am talking about self-paced training, where you have to complete your training on your own. And without proper guidance, it is really tough. Yes, it is too tough. We, at Technovids, believe in new methods of training, that is instructor-led training, where your training will be conducted on the cloud platform with our experienced trainers. In this training, we keep in mind your educational development through proper guidance, hands-on training, and recordings of every session. Yeah, hands-on training, isn't it interesting? With these training methods, our aspirants are surely going to rise high in their career. Oh, no, not like that. But would be more successful, in other words. With 50+ technology, Technovids is raising high as the emerging top best training institute. So what are you waiting for? Join us to be the change.
To create at the end, finally, some pivot tables and some slicers as well, right? So the data which I'm going to use for this particular example is this data, where we have invoice numbers, some dates of that particular invoice, who has worked on that corresponding invoice, and product, price, units, and sales. Some set of information is there. So on top of this, I'm going to create a pivot table using my VBA code. So let's see how to do that. Top pivot. Visual Basic. Okay, so even manually when you are creating, whatever steps we follow, the same steps we are going to follow as in VBA also. So that is, first we are supposed to select our sheet where our source data is there. That is our pivots using VBA is the sheet. Okay, so first we'll select that, and then what we do, we'll just go to the insert tab. The very first option under that is pivot table, correct? The same sequence will follow in the VBA code also. The very first step is to take the data that is in my worksheets, that is pivots using VBA is the worksheets in which my data table is there. Inside that, I'm actually taking the entire set of data. So, again, it is, you can hard code it, or if you feel it is dynamic, then you can use this current read method. Even that is fine. So that will take the entire data starting from A1 till the end of the data set. Here it is 145 records are there, so it will take till the end. Okay, so yeah, dot current region I've taken. And now next thing is, when you are creating a pivot table manually, you will get a window where it will ask whether you want to create the pivot table in a new worksheet or existing worksheet. Okay, so that's the thing which we need to select here. Let's say we generally prefer creating a new worksheet, okay, or even you can use a existing worksheet. Both are fine. Okay, so that thing we'll do in code by going, and I'm adding a worksheet now. Currently sheets.add or worksheets.add. Both the lines of code will give you the same result of adding a new worksheet. Okay, and I'm assigning that to a variable. Even previously, when I assign my data A1.current region, I'm assigning to a variable called SRC data. So SRC data I should declare, right? So SRC data, it's a range, of course. So I declare it as a range. It's a set of data, right? So it's a range. So SRC data has been declared. Similarly, when I say sheets.add, I'm adding a new sheet, and I'm assigning it to the variable called SHT. Once again, it's a worksheet. It's not a range, it's a worksheet. So dim SHT as worksheet. Okay, so you have to declare it as a worksheet. So these are all collection variables. Okay, these are all variables or object variables, we call it as, because we have multiple cells of content being stored. So we need to use a keyword called set keyword. Similarly, here also when you use a worksheet is a collection, of course. It's an object variable which contains multiple cells. So sheet.add is being assigned to a variable called SHT, which is declared as worksheet and being assigned using a keyword called set keyword. Okay, so these are the two lines to set your source data and set your destination sheet. Okay, so once your destination sheet is designed, you are supposed to design, identify where you are actually keeping the pivot table. Okay, so the destination we need to basically specify. So I could say sheet dot, of course, range of where exactly your pivot table has to come and set, whether it is A1, A5, A3, whatever it is. So I take A3. Okay, like this we can specify, and I wanted to display it in a variable again. So everything we'll take it in variables because that needs to be passed when we are creating a pivot table. So the same thing, I'll be passing it to a variable by writing the code like this: start pivot. Okay, so start pivot is another variable where my pivot destination range is being defined. Okay, destination is sheet, of course, new sheet. Inside that new sheet, where exactly you are trying to create the pivot, that cell reference we need to specify. Okay, so range of A3 is what I'm taking, sheet dot, of course, because in this new sheet you are doing. So sheet dot range A3, that I'm assigning to a variable called start pivot. Start pivot is a variable. It's again a cell reference, so it is being defined as a range. Okay, so these are the few initial things we need to do before creating the pivot table. Okay, so I've just given comments also. Determine the source data range where the source data is there. Create a new sheet object, new sheet. If you are not interested in creating a new sheet, you can say sheets of, let's say if you have sheet 3, then you can say sheet 3 set, sheets of sheet 3. Like this you specify. So now SHT is a variable which contains the existing sheet, which is sheet 3. Otherwise, if you want to add, you can adapt to us how we want to define the code. So let's go and add a new sheet. So I say add. Okay, and then the pivot table destination, that is the range where exactly I wanted to keep the pivot inside the newly created worksheet. Is what I'm specifying here. Yes. And then comes two things basically. See, when you create a manual pivot table, if you create a pivot table manually, I say new existing sheet. Okay, you see there, this is called an empty pivot where we have not yet created a pivot. Okay, so this particular thing where it is, created empty pivot is called pivot cache. Pivot cache. Okay, so pivot cache refers to an empty pivot table. In fact, it's like a memory. Okay, memory allocated to the pivot table where you can actually start creating a new pivot table. That is called a pivot cache. Okay, so every pivot, when you are creating, especially in VBA, you are supposed to create a pivot cache first. That means your code has to allocate some memory some memory needs to be allocated such that you can create your pivot table by dragging and dropping your fields. So first thing, we need to create this pivot cache using the code, and then create a pivot table on top of that pivot cache. You can directly say create pivot. Okay, so for that we need a code to be written to create a pivot cache. So where you are going to create a pivot cache, we need to specify that. So in the active workbook, so I'll just write it out. Active workbook. In the active workbook dot, there is a collection called pivot cache. Pivot cache. You can see the pivot caches. Okay, so pivot caches. You are trying to create a pivot cache, right? So dot, there is a method called create method. Okay, so you're creating a pivot cache. So pivot cache dot create dot create. Okay, now when you say open bracket, it will ask you what is the source type. Okay, source type, whether it's a connection or it's a database or it's bringing somewhere from the external table, or the source data itself is a pivot table or not. Something like that scenarios will come. but mostly it would be a database. We have a database in another sheet, right? So Excel database is what we need to select most of the times, because we'll be constructing the pivot table on top of a data which is already present in the Excel. So it is Excel database is what we need to select. Secondly, you need to specify what is the source data. Where is the source data coming from? Okay, yes, you can see there source data. That is why we already created a variable called src data for picking up all my entire data from the source sheet. Okay, so I would use that variable src data. Okay, close bracket. And of course, again, this is going to be creating a pivot cache. So I'm going to assign this to a variable which is already defined called pvt cache. You can see that the second line at the top, pvt cache as pivot cache. I've already declared it as a pivot cache, so I can take that here. Pvt cache is equals to so and so. Okay. Now the empty pivot memory, whatever you are creating, will get created, and it will be on top of this variable called pivot cache. Okay. So active workbook dot pivot cache, active workbook dot pivot cache dot create. You're creating a pivot cache on top of a database, and this is the source data. Okay, so that is how we have to construct that, and this is the same thing actually. So create pivot cache from source data. This is my source data, Excel database, pivot cache dot create. That's it. Okay. Now on top of this pivot cache, we need to create a pivot table. Okay. Now that is why the next line will be pivot cache dot. Okay, now you are trying to create a pivot table. So create pivot table, you can see there create pivot table is there. So I'll have to take that create pivot table dot open bracket. Yeah, it's open bracket, sorry. Okay, so open bracket, we have table destination, table name. Where is the destination where you are actually trying to put the pivot table? Yes, we have given it as a start pivot. So I say start pivot, comma, table name. You can specify your own table name. Okay, so I could say something like this. So let's say sales data, sales pivot, or something, some name you can give. It's up to you, whatever name you want to specify. Okay, and the rest of the things is not required. You can just close your pivot table method, and this I have created one more variable, dim pvt as pivot table. So pvt refers to the pivot table, pvt cache refers to the pivot cache. So I will assign this variable set pvt is equals to pivot cache dot create pivot table is the method. Okay. So if you do this, create pivot table, then actual pivot table gets created with a name. So you can see here the pivot table name currently is pivot table 1. That is the name of the pivot table by default. It will take that. Now you can specify whatever name you want to give. Okay. So the same thing I would have given it now. Create pivot table from pivot cache. So it's pivot cache dot create pivot table start pivot comma. Here I've given it as my pivot. I'll change this to sales, something like this. Okay, that's it. So this is the process of creating a pivot table from a source database. So mainly these are the two steps which you have to focus on. One is to create the pivot cache, the other one is to create the pivot table. So pivot cache will be created using active workbook dot pivot cache dot create, and then follow the parameters, which is Excel database and source data. Once you create the pivot cache dot create pivot table, and then open bracket, what is the table destination, comma, what is the name of the pivot table. Even name of the pivot table is also optional. If you want, you can specify, or you can just ignore that. Okay, so anything is fine. So yes, now till here whatever we have done is to create an empty pivot table. Okay, empty pivot table. But now on top of this we need to create the drag and drop the fields, correct? Drag and drop the fields to wherever you want to drag. Okay, So for that, we will write another macro. Come back to delete. Yes. So till here, whatever we have written is same. That is, pivot. Here I am taking sheet.a3, that is destination start pivot, and active pivot dot create Excel database source data. This is also same. Here I am creating the pivot table. Till here, every code remains same. Okay, so again here I will rename to sales pivot, something like this. Okay, now on top of this, we need to create our or drag and drop our field names such that we can start constructing our pivot table. Okay, now we have few columns like sales rep, product, and all that. Okay, so any column you want to drag it into the rows, any column you want to drag it into the columns, that you can do now using your code. Okay, now it says PVT stands for the pivot table dot. Okay, pivot fields is the thing to access a particular column name from the pivot table. So pivot fields of whatever is the column you are trying to drag it into the pivot, that we need to specify here. Okay, so let's say I'm dragging sales rep, that is the column I wanted. Okay, now this what I will do, I will assign to a variable. So as I said, PVT field, I have declared another variable called PVT field. PVT field is equals to, so if you go back and see, PVT field as pivot field. Okay, all these are available. You can say pivot field, so it is available there. Okay, so for the pivot table, we need 3 pivot variables. One is pivot cache, the other one is pivot table, the third one here is pivot field for selecting a column and dragging it into the wherever you want it, dragging into the row field or column field or whatever. Okay, now currently I have just taken a variable set pivot field is equals to pivot pvt dot pivot fields of the sales rep or whatever column name. Now that needs to be dragged into my row field, let's say row field. Then I can use same pivot field variable dot. There is a method called orientation. Orientation is the method which is used to drag a particular column either into the rows or into the columns or into the page field or data field, whatever it is. Okay, now see, this is called row field, this is called column field, this is called data field, values wherever is there towards the right, that is called data field. Okay, and this is called page field, filters is there, right? That's called page field. That means it's a filter as such. So if you say dot orientation is equals to, you can see the list here. Column field, row field is there, okay, data field is there, and page field is there. Page field refers to the filter, row field, column field of course, and data field refers to the values. Okay, let's say if I have to drag my sales representative into my rows. So I can select Excel row field. Okay. Now this is the code to drag and drop. How you do drag and drop manually to replace that? This is the code. Okay. First, see, some people I generally prefer like this to be more clear. PVT fields. Whatever field name, I will assign that to a variable. Okay, and then that variable dot orientation is equals to row field. What few people prefer doing is Control C, Control V. Now here only you can say dot orientation. Okay, but it doesn't display the IntelliSense list. But instead of assigning this set of line into a variable and then say dot orientation, some people will directly say dot orientation is equals to Excel. But it doesn't display the IntelliSense list.
Yes.
Even this is fine. This is also correct. Okay. That means we are not taking any additional variable here. We are directly doing it like this. But I generally don't prefer because I don't get the intelligence list. The spelling is also wrong. Orientation, something like this. Okay, so even you can try doing this as well. This is also fine. But to be more specific and to be more clear, I always generally try preferring like this. Take one variable name and then assign this entire thing to that, and then say dot orientation. PVT field dot orientation is equals to, and it displays this also. Whether you want to display row field, column field, or everything. Okay, so like this, you can start assigning values to wherever you want. Now you can see at the down, I am taking pivot fields of product into the columns, sales rep into the row field. Okay, and then invoice number into the page field, that is the filter part. Invoice number, I want the filter, and finally the value, that is the data field. So I have my sales column that I'm dragging into my data field. Okay, so while dragging into the data field, especially for the data field, we have multiple parameters or multiple properties to be accessed. Okay, now I can do this. PVT field dot orientation is equals to, I want to drag it into the data field. Similarly, PVT field, you can specify the summarization. Okay, which function you want to use. By default, it would be sum of sales. You can even change it to average of sales. Let's say I want to change it to average of sales. You can say dot function is equal, so it will show you the functions here. Okay, whether count function, minimum function, maximum function, average function, whatever it is. So I'm going for average this time, let's say. Okay, and you can specify some number formats as well. PVT field dot number format is equals to double quotations. Let's say I want to specify a dollar format. So double quotations, dollar. So when you say data field, it is going into the values. Okay, so average is a summarization, number format is 0, and you can try accessing other properties as well. So as of now, we'll just stick to this. Now I will say width. Okay, you know width block. For if it is repeating multiple times, we can give width. Pivot field dot orientation, pivot field dot function, pivot field dot number format. Okay, it's the same thing I would have written down. Pivot field dot orientation, function, number. See, position is another property. Position refers to, see, if you see here, I can say the sales is there. I can drag it once. Okay, and let's say I can also drag units as well. Okay, I can do this. So now what position refers to, which is at the top, which is at the next. Okay, now when I say position for sales is 1, it will be at the top. Or if I say position of units as 1, then units will be at the top. So it will just move it towards the something like that. So how your position needs to be defined, you can just arrange it accordingly by using a property called position. Okay, so that particular data field where it has to be. If it is only 1, then you need not worry about the position, because anyways it is 1. But if you are dragging multiple columns into the data field, that time you are supposed to specify the position. As of now, I'll remove this. So these are final things. PVT.manual update is equals to false. When you do this, the flickering of pivot table all will not be displayed, but then it's okay. Even if you don't specify that, it's fine, not an issue. Yes. Okay. So let's go create a pivot table using the code. So I'll just delete this. This is my data on which I'm going to create the pivot. So let's minimize this. Okay, let's keep it side by side and run it. Wait. So pivots using VBA, it will select that particular sheet, and then specified sheet 3. 3. Sheet 3 is not there in this. So let me add a new sheet. Sheets dot add. So it will now add a new sheet, F8. So one new sheet has been added, and the table destination will be in A3. So I've specified or assigned it to a variable called start pivot. And now an empty pivot cache. Memory may one inside the memory, one new cache or one new memory allocation will happen. Okay, and when you say create pivot table, now is that you get a empty pivot getting created, empty pivot table getting created, and you can see there the name of the pivot table is being taken as sales PVT. So that is also fine. Now the dragging part will start. So columns may I'm dragging product. So if I do this, you see there column labels, you have products. Similarly, row labels, I have my sales representatives, and invoice number will be the filter, that is page field. You can see there invoice number is being taken as the filter, and finally the data field. So sales will be the data field. It will come to the data values. You can see there values being populated, and I don't want sum of sales. By default, it is sum of sales. Now I'm changing the functionality to average of sales. It will change to average, and I wanted the number formats to be dollar. You can see there dollars has been appended. So end with end sum. So it has created a pivot table without any manual intervention. You just run that code, a pivot table gets created like this. The main thing which you need to understand is to syntax. There is a syntax we need to remember. That's the only thing we need to remember. Apart from that, everything is fine. And yeah, variables you need to declare properly for you to access all the methods and properties of the pivot related objects and methods. You have to properly declare. Declaration variables is also very important. So which I mean, that's what initially we might not know what are the variables we require, but by the on the go, when you start writing the code, then and where we require variables, those variables we have to keep declaring. Initially, when you are assigning worksheet data, source data, then we declare this variable called source data, which is a range, of course. So I say dim source data as range. Similarly, when you are adding a new sheet, I want a sheet variable, so sheet variable will be added. Okay, and then comes the destination. Destination, I should specify something. Again, that's a range. Similarly, these are the important variables: pivot cache and pivot table. So active when you're creating pivot cache, you need to make sure that it is declared as a pivot cache. PVT cache as pivot cache. Similarly, PVT is for creating a pivot table. So that is being declared as a pivot table. So only advantage of now creating this variables and declaring these variables is when you say pivot PVT, now you will be able to access all the methods and properties of that pivot table related things. If you don't declare it, you will not be able to visualize all this. Then it will be very difficult for you to construct the code. That is how you create an entire pivot table. So try doing it from your end. Just follow the syntax whatever we write here, and then you will be able to create a table.